Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Reel. Viewer and listening discretion is advised. For today's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the first part of the story of the Stayner family and how their lives became defined by crime. Delbert Foy Stayner, known as Del, was born on the 14th of May 1933 in Farmington, New Mexico. He was one of 5 children born to Jesse and Luella Stayner, along with Jesse Jr., Anna Mae, Sharon, and Maxine. Del served in the US Army as a staff sergeant from 1953 to 1957. Upon his return from the Army, he met a lady by the name of Kay Augustine. Kay was born in Weaverville, California, and was 8 years younger than Del. In 1960, Del and Kay married. Del worked as a mechanic, and Kay helped to make ends meet by taking service jobs wherever she could find them. The couple went on to have 5 children, 2 boys, Cary and Steven, as well as 3 daughters, Cindy, Jody and Corey. Cary was the oldest child. He was very protective of all of his siblings and was particularly close to his younger brother Steven. The family lived in Merced, California, sometimes known as the gateway to Yosemite. Merced is a city approximately 130 miles from San Francisco, which had a rapidly growing population during the 1970s. Monday, December the 4th, 1972, started out like any other day in the Stayner household. With 5 young children, mornings were generally busy and chaotic. The children attended local schools, with 7-year-old Steven enrolled at the Charles Wright Elementary School, which was located about half a mile from the family home in Bett Street. As was typical of the time, the children would often walk themselves to and from school. On that particular Monday afternoon, Steven was walking home by himself after finishing school for the day. When he was just a few blocks from his house, he was approached by a seemingly friendly man by the name of Irvin Edward Murphy. Irvin asked Steven if his mother would be interested in donating some items to the church fundraiser, and Steven replied that he believed she would. The man offered Steven a ride home. Steven declined, saying that he was only a couple of blocks from his house. However, the man was persistent, saying that it would be easier for them to travel together to collect the donations, and so Steven agreed and climbed into the back of the old white Buick. Driving the car was 41-year-old Kenneth Parnell. Kenneth was born on 26th of September 1931 in Amarillo, Texas. After his father abandoned the family, his mother moved to California and opened a boarding house. At 14 years old, Kenneth was abused by one of the tenants. Following this, Kenneth descended into a life of crime, including arson, car theft, and public indecency. In 1951, a criminal complaint was filed against Kenneth for abusing an 8-year-old boy. He was found guilty and sent to a hospital for psychiatric assessment. Here, he was diagnosed as being a sexual psychopath. It was recommended that he be held indefinitely, but he escaped shortly afterwards. 5 months later, he was recaptured and given a sentence of 5 years in prison. However, after just 3 years, in 1955, he was paroled on the condition that he seek counselling. After another short prison spell for parole violation, he moved to Utah in 1960 and was soon convicted of robbery and larceny and again imprisoned. He was released in 1967 on the condition that he left the state of Utah forever. Kenneth later moved to California and started work at the Yosemite Lodge, where he met Irvin. Kenneth, who often referred to himself as Reverend, had managed to convince Irvin that he was a religious leader and that he was acting upon God's wishes in order to take a young boy and give them a better life. Irvin, who suffered from learning difficulties, was easily convinced by the manipulative Kenneth. As they drove away that day, Steven realised that they had passed the road where he lived. When he told the 2 men, they replied that they would call his parents to ask if he could stay the night with them. Although curious, Steven was not particularly afraid at this point. Through talking to Steven, Kenneth gleaned information as to the family's money worries and also that Steven had been in trouble with his parents recently. He would use this information to manipulate the young boy. They arrived at a cabin in Cathy's Valley which was around 20 miles from Merced. The men had already purchased lots of toys in preparation for their abduction of a child. While Steven was initially distracted by the toys, he started to become increasingly anxious, asking to go home to his parents. Again, he was reassured by his captors that his parents had given permission for him to stay. Kenneth, using the information that he had gained from Steven, told him that he needed to stay away from his family for a while as he had been so badly behaved. On that first night, the abuse began. On the third day, Kenneth went out, leaving Irvin to take care of Steven. When Kenneth returned, he told Steven that he had been to court and had now legally adopted him. Kenneth said that Steven's parents no longer wanted him, nor could afford to keep him. Steven was shocked and begged to go home. However, Kenneth simply told Steven that he was his dad now and that Steven's new name would be Dennis. Kenneth also told Steven to start calling him Dad. Kenneth and Irvin decided to move Steven to live in the cabin at Yosemite Lodge where they lived and worked. After a few weeks at the cabin, Kenneth realised he needed a more permanent solution if he was going to be able to keep Steven out of sight and the boy's true identity hidden. He took Steven to live in Santa Rosa, leaving Irvin behind. The sexual, emotional and psychological abuse continued. Kenneth enrolled Steven in a local school under the name of Kenneth Parnell and warned Steven that he must never tell anyone his true identity. When Steven asked about his family, Kenneth told him that his dad was dead and the remaining family members had moved away from the area. Under Kenneth's constant manipulation, Steven believed that he had nowhere else to go and no one else wanted him. Kenneth and Steven remained living in Santa Rosa for around 3 years before moving to various other remote trailer parks, cabins and motels throughout Northern California. Against all of the odds, Steven did well in school, was popular and had many friends. At some point after Kenneth abducted Steven, Kenneth became involved with a woman by the name of Barbara Matthias. Barbara lived with Kenneth and Steven for around 18 months. It is reported that not only was Barbara aware of Kenneth's abuse of Steven, she actively participated in it during the time of her relationship with Kenneth. Meanwhile, the Stayner family were desperately trying to find Steven. Dell, Steven's father, became obsessed with tracking down every lead and was known to suddenly pack up his family in the car and drive across California to follow up on a sighting. None of these sightings ever actually led him any closer to Steven. As time went on, the once pragmatic Dell withdrew from his family, becoming angry and dejected. Relationships became strained with his other children, particularly his eldest son, Cary, as the search for Steven consumed his life. Del and Kay were later recorded as stating that they had neglected their other 4 children during this time as the emotional, physical and financial toll of searching for their missing son pushed them to breaking point. At some points, Del lost all hope. Kay, on the other hand, did her best to keep the family together and never stopped believing that her son would someday be found. In the Stayner house, feelings and emotions were not generally discussed. Counselling or therapy was not pursued for any of the family members. Kay received no support from her father, who had always been openly critical about her decision to have a large family. When Steven went missing, her father told her that they should be glad as it meant one less child to feed and clothe. Steven's brother and sisters found the loss of their brother extremely difficult to deal with. Early on, Cary would walk outside every time there was a clear night to wish upon a star for Steven's return. As the children grew, they were always known as the kids whose brother had been kidnapped. Cary would often wear a hat as he had started to compulsively pull his hair out from the stress that he was under. He threw his energy into becoming creative and would lose himself in his drawings, becoming a skilled cartoonist. However, he seemed to have increasing difficulty maintaining any personal relationships and became more and more isolated. By the end of 1979, which was 7 years after Steven's abduction, Kenneth and the now 14-year-old Steven had moved to an isolated, run-down cabin in Manchester, California. Steven was allowed to drink, smoke and take drugs from a very young age. With Kenneth's permission, he was allowed to leave the house, but had been so brainwashed by Kenneth, he would always decide to return. With Steven now growing into a young man, Kenneth was starting to lose interest in him sexually. and wanted a new young boy to abuse and control. Kenneth attempted to get Steven to assist him in taking another child, but Steven would deliberately fail to follow his instructions in order to sabotage any kidnapping attempt. Believing Steven to be incompetent, Kenneth managed to convince one of Steven's friends, a local boy by the name of Sean Porman, to assist him. He bribed Sean with drugs and money, before finally threatening him in order to get him to help with the kidnapping. On 13th of February 1980, a 5-year-old boy by the name of Timmy White was playing in front of his parents' house in Ukiah, California. Sean approached Timmy and tried to persuade him to get into Kenneth's car. Timmy refused and tried to run indoors, but Sean grabbed him and forced the screaming young boy into the back of the car. Kenneth immediately set to work brainwashing Timmy, telling him that he would now be his dad. Kenneth also told him that from now on he would be called Tommy, not Timmy. When they returned to the cabin, Kenneth dyed little Timmy's blonde hair dark brown. And when Steven returned from school that day, he was told that Timmy was his new younger brother. Realising that the same fate that he had endured awaited Timmy, something in Steven snapped and he realised that he needed to act. Steven quickly formed a close bond with the young boy and he knew that he had to help him escape. On 1st of March 1980, while Kenneth was working the night shift at a nearby hotel, Steven and Timmy left the cabin. They walked for miles from their remote home before a passing trucker gave them a lift to Ukiah, which was over 40 miles away. Steven had planned to return Timmy home, but the distressed 5-year-old could only remember that he lived in Ukiah, but not the specific address. Steven decided to take Timmy to the police station. He explained to Timmy what to say and sent him inside alone, but Timmy was frightened and he ran back to Steven. Unable to persuade Timmy to go into the police station by himself, Steven accompanied him inside. When police saw the missing young boy, who had been the subject of a lot of media attention, it was initially assumed that Steven was the one who had taken him. However, when police interviewed Steven, he told them that he had also been taken as a young boy. He told the police, "I know my first name is Steven. I think my last name is Stayner." When pressed further about what had happened, Steven told the police officers about Kenneth, who was arrested and charged shortly after. Timmy's parents, Angie and James, soon arrived at the police station to collect their little boy, and Steven's parents were contacted to say that he had been found. The police drove Steven back to his family home in Merced. The family had never moved from the house, in the hope that Steven would one day find his way back to them. By the time the police arrived with Steven, the house on Bett Street was surrounded by reporters. It became a huge news story that this little boy had finally returned home. Steven was hailed a hero for his bravery in rescuing young Timmy. Television appearances, book deals, and newspaper interviews quickly followed. It would seem that no one could get enough of this so-called amazing happy ending. However, despite the blaze of positive publicity, Steven's return home was not without difficulty. After suffering over 7 years of intense physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological abuse, Steven struggled to settle into life with his family. Whilst he said that his parents really hadn't changed that much, he barely recognised his brother and sisters. Steven was used to living with one other person, where he was allowed to smoke, drink and take drugs, and he was suddenly a 14-year-old young man who had been dropped into a busy family with typical family rules. Cary, who was away on a camping trip in Yosemite when he heard of Steven's return, was initially elated that his younger brother had been found. However, the two boys, now 18 and 14, found it impossible to reform the bond that they had shared when they were younger. Steven returned to school, but had a difficult time resuming his studies. With Kenneth's trial looming closer and intense public interest, he would often be away from class. When certain schoolmates found out about the details of Steven's ordeal, he was bullied relentlessly about his past and his sexuality. In the summer of 1981, Kenneth went on trial for the kidnapping of Timmy White. Both Timmy and Steven testified, and after less than 2 hours of jury deliberations, Kenneth was found guilty of the second-degree kidnapping of Timmy. He received the maximum sentence allowed by the law at the time, 7 years in prison. Due to his age at the time, Sean Porman, who had assisted Kenneth with Timmy's abduction, was sentenced to a short spell in a juvenile detention centre. Later that year, on December 1st, 1981, Kenneth and Irvin went on trial for the kidnapping of Stephen and an additional conspiracy charge. Pat Halford, the Merced County District Attorney at the time, wanted to prosecute Kenneth for all of the abuse crimes, but due to the statute of limitations in California at the time, this was not allowed. Again, both Stephen and Timmy testified at the trial. The defence argued that Stephen was away from Kenneth's control and could have left at any time, with prosecutors arguing that he was a psychological prisoner. When Stephen was asked why he hadn't tried to escape earlier, he said that he believed everything that Kenneth had told him, that his family did not want him, that his father was dead, and that Kenneth was now his adoptive father. However, once Timmy arrived, he could not bear the thought of another child suffering in the way he had. Both Kenneth and Irvin were found guilty on 24th of December 1981. Barbara Mathias, who had a relationship with Kenneth and participated in Stephen's abuse, was never charged. On 7th of January 1982, at Alameda County Superior Court, Irvin received a 5-year sentence on each count. The terms would run concurrently. Kenneth received a 2-year sentence for Stephen's kidnapping and a 5-year sentence for conspiracy to kidnap. Again, these sentences would run concurrently with each other and his previous sentence for Timmy's kidnapping. This was the maximum punishment allowed by California law at the time. As a result of this insultingly low sentence and the public outcry which followed, changes were made to state law which allowed for full consecutive rather than concurrent terms for child kidnappings in similar cases. With the trials over, both Stephen and Timmy continued to return to a more normal life. Timmy's ordeal had been short in comparison to Stephen's, and he managed to reintegrate into family life well. However, Stephen continued to struggle. By the time he was 19, he had over $1,100 of outstanding parking fines and had lost his driving licence. He did not manage to graduate from high school and was struggling to fit in with his family's regular lifestyle. Other than a few sessions with a counsellor, Stephen did not receive any mental health support. Eventually, the relationships within the family home broke down to such a point that Dell asked Stephen to move out. Stephen still persevered and was determined to forge a better life for himself. He started a welding course at the local college in the hope of being able to get a better job. He also began a relationship with a local girl by the name of Jodie Edmondson. In 1984, Dell and Cary Stayner were quoted as saying that their wish for Stephen was that he would be able to find a good job and lead a happy life. In 1985, the family were dealt another blow. With time off for good behaviour, Kenneth was released from prison on the 5th of April. He had served just 5 years of his sentence, 2 years less than the length of Stephen's ordeal. 2 months later, 20-year-old Stephen married 17-year-old Jodie, and they also welcomed their first child, Ashley, in December 1985. Despite all of the odds, Stephen was repairing his life. The young couple welcomed a second child, Stephen Jr., in May 1987. Stephen had started to attend church and was volunteering to help others who had gone through a similar ordeal to him. He also spent time educating young children to protect them from enduring a similar fate. Whilst obviously still battling many demons, Jodie was confident that Stephen was recovering and healing. He was obviously still in a great deal of pain, but he was getting through it. He was a survivor. On 5th of April 1988, Kenneth completed his probation period. At that point, he was free to travel wherever he wanted and associate with whoever he chose, including children. At around the same time, a mini-series called I Know My First Name is Stephen was being made with Stephen's full cooperation. The production weighed heavily on Stephen, and he was relieved once it had been completed. Despite the toll it took on him personally, Stephen was determined to be involved with anything that would make his story known and could raise awareness for other children. Stephen was also working at a local pizza restaurant. On 16th of September 1989, following his shift at the restaurant, Stephen was riding home on his motorcycle, which he had purchased using some of the money that he earned from the television series. A vineyard worker in a truck pulled out in front of Stephen's motorcycle, knocking Stephen off of his bike. Stephen was not wearing a helmet and sustained massive head injuries. He was rushed to Merced Community Medical Centre, but he was declared dead on arrival. He was just 24 years old. His wife Jodie became a widow and single mother to their 3-year-old daughter and 2-year-old son at just 20 years of age. Steven's parents, Kay and Dell, were on a camping trip at the time of the accident. Friends had to track them down to let them know the devastating news. The driver of the truck, Antonio Lura, did not stop at the scene of the accident. Antonio surrendered himself to police in Tijuana 4 days later. He was charged with felony hit and run and manslaughter. He was found guilty and sentenced to just 3 months in jail and a $100 fine. 14-year-old Timmy White was a pallbearer at Steven's funeral. After Steven's death, Dell and Kay sold the family home, stating that they wanted to get away from the area in order to try to wash away some of the bad memories. In 2003, 15 years after the end of his probation period, Kenneth was arrested at his home in San Francisco after a police investigation uncovered his plan to buy a child. During a police sting operation, he was found to be trying to purchase a 4-year-old boy online for $500. I've been unable to find any additional information about the 15-year period between the end of Kenneth's probation and this arrest, but it would seem incredibly unlikely that he became a law-abiding citizen during this period. At Kenneth's new trial, Timmy was again called to testify, along with Sean Portman, the teenager who had been coerced into helping Kenneth abduct Timmy. It was the first time that Timmy and Sean had seen each other since Timmy's abduction 24 years earlier. After speaking briefly, the two hugged, Timmy having forgiven Sean for his part in the abduction. On 25th of April 2004, Kenneth was again found guilty and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. He died in Vacaville prison on 21st of January 2008 at the age of 76. The year after the trial, at the age of 30, Timmy White became a Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department deputy and, like Steven before him, gave talks to children in the hope that he could avoid them ever having to experience what both Steven and him endured. Just 5 years later, on April 1st, 2010, Timmy died of a pulmonary embolism. He was just 35 years old. He was survived by his wife Dina, 2 children, his parents, and his sister. This concludes the first part of our narration about the Stayner family and how crime had impacted their lives. We shall continue this story looking at what happened after Steven's untimely death in part 2. Psst, 28th of August 2010, a statue of Steven and Timmy was unveiled at the entrance to Applegate Park in Merced. Local residents had worked for 7 years to create a monument recognising Steven's bravery and dedicated to all missing children. Goodbye.